أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم اللهم إنا نستهديك لأرشد منا وزدنا علما ينفعنا عنه. Okay, I think we'll just start in English. Before we start, actually, I want to apologize for, English is not my native language, but I will try as best I can. And I know that there are people who speak better than me. When you see that I am struggling finding the correct words, feel free to help me. And yeah, I don't know if anyone has problems with English. If you have any problems with understanding anything, because sometimes you know English but not maybe the technical terms, so just feel free to ask anything you want. Okay, and also I want to apologize in advance to Sheikh Abdurrahman, because maybe from time to time I have to interrupt you. I don't mean it like disrespectfully, but just when I, for example, see that I didn't understand something properly, I just maybe someone thinks like me. Please forgive me. Today we have Sheikh Abdurrahman Mihirig with us. Does anyone of you know Sheikh Abdurrahman? Yeah, maybe some. For me personally, Sheikh Abdurrahman is a very important figure in my life, in my way of understanding things. Unfortunately, he is not very known yet because he doesn't want to, but we want to people to benefit, inshallah, and so we start this meeting. Maybe just to introduce yourself, Sidi. Can you tell us something about who are you? Just maybe some words about that.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Wa ba'd. Thank you for the kind invitation to come to Osnabrück. Inshallah, أكون عند حسن ظنك بي. I also apologize that I've been living in Germany for 5 years and I still haven't learned the language properly, so I would have preferred to speak to you all in German, but I'm just finishing my PhD at the LMU in München, at the Faculty of Philosophy there, working with Professor Peter Adamson. It's one of the few chairs in Arabic philosophy. It's called Arabic and Antique Philosophy. Before that, I spent a little bit of time in the US where I did master's. I'm not an American. I know people in Europe just hear the accent and they assume that they must be American. There's another country over there, they also...
It's also America, right? It's not the States, but...
We're Canadians. Canadians are Americans who don't have voting rights.
Okay.
So I was in the States for a little bit. Before that, I was in Jordan, where I worked for an organization called Kalam Research and Media. It's run by a man named Dr. Arif al-Nayl, who is also one of my teachers in Ilm al-Kalam and in philosophy. And I also studied there with other Jordanian scholars, most notably, who's more famous than, especially in Ilm al-Kalam, Sheikh Saeed Foda. I also spent time studying in Turkey. So I lived there for about 3 years. So I learned Turkish. I didn't learn German, but
in 3 years you learned Turkish, but in 5 years you didn't learn.
Well, that's it's because all the Germans speak English.
So the Germans speak so good English, you didn't have to.
Exactly. Especially at most of my time is at the university, so. And now there are, you're not required to know German in many areas to do your PhD in Germany now. So.
Yeah. And also, we don't have like chai ever here.
There's no chai, there's just beer gardens. So if you don't drink beer, then there's really not much for you to do at those places. Yeah. So in Turkey, you can learn the language easily by spending time at the chai hane. In those days, chai was 1 lira. Now I think it's quite a bit more. But alhamdulillah. So I've been studying. I've studied some of the Islamic sciences privately, and also pursuing academic studies as well. And I'm just about finished the PhD. Inshallah, my defense is soon, next month, or at least a month from now. I mean, and a few years ago, this is how I met Ustad Anas and Ustad Zamwal and Tariq Yabuz, Hafidhullah. We met about 4 years ago, I guess. 4 years ago. I'm not good with time. But the idea, I had written a paper against a colleague of mine in the department, and it was read, I guess, by Ustad Tariq, and he emailed me, and I guess they looked around and they said, "Oh, this guy's in Munich. Let's reach out to him." And they visited me in Munich about 4 years ago, I think. Something like that, 4 or 5. I think 4 years ago. It was before Corona. And alhamdulillah, we have spent a lot of time since then studying many texts together. Many, but 2 long texts very carefully together. And alhamdulillah, it's been a great friendship. It's made my time here in Germany much more special.
During your studies, you said that you studied with like teachers the traditional way. Like when I say traditional way, I mean mainly like completing or reading classical texts, and also academically. What's the difference between these two for your personal development? Did you more benefit from academia, or did you more benefit from your traditional learning, or can you even compare these two?
I think they can be compared to some extent, fruitfully. I think I've benefited in different ways from both kinds of study. I think, however, there is a difference. I think a lot of people have somewhat of I don't know how it is in Germany. I know it's a bit different because Germany has these islamische Theologie faculty, and it's a bit different because it's supposed to be where the faculty is all Muslims, and it's supposed to be something similar to the Catholic and the Protestant theology faculties. Of course, it's not as strict because Muslims don't have like church membership or something like this, but what I appreciate, especially about being in the faculty of philosophy, is that you're surrounded by people who are only interested in the arguments and the evidence for and against. They are not people who are kind of interested primarily in historical investigations or the kind of usual interests of, let's say, Orientalist scholars or something like this, which is maybe Germany is quite famous for having some of these people. There was, for example, a famous German professor, Josef van Es, who passed away a few years ago. He wrote a huge 4-volume work in German. It's been translated into Arabic and I think also English recently. but it's mostly the interests there are kind of purely historical interest. And so I think you miss out a lot on the what's actually beneficial in these works when you look at it strictly from a kind of historical or philological perspective. And being in a philosophy department, or even a professor who, let's say, is more interested in the content than in the circumstances, where did this person live, who were they, who influenced him, who did he influence? These are all kind of, I find them to be important. It's not like they're not important questions, but I don't think you can really appreciate the value of these texts unless you are in a kind of philosophy setting. And I would say that people who study these texts from a philosophical perspective, they share in some important ways with traditional scholars, because also traditional scholars, other than mentioning some kind of brief biographical things in the beginning, what they're interested in are the problems, and they kind of look at the problems almost timelessly. You can mention 2 or 3 names in the same sentence, even though they lived centuries apart, and that's totally fine, and nobody makes a big deal out of it. So from the purely kind of technical side, I think these 2 experiences are complementary. They can be very complementary, and there's plenty of people who in the academy who do respect the Islamic tradition, and not just the ones that are associated with the West, for example. So there's a lot of people who are interested only in Muslim thinkers who are translated into Latin and form a part of their universe, but there are some others who they work on Ibn Jinni, and they work on Sibawayh and so on, people who are never translated or read or unknown in the West, and they can recognize the philosophical and the scientific value to those texts. But of course, at the end of the day, your relationship with your professors in university is not the same as your relationship with your teachers in a traditional setting. And the kind of investment that the mashayikh will put in their students is because they feel that this is a kind of obligation, and you feel that there's further obligations. It's not a kind of transactional environment. You feel like you have a certain responsibility to carry on certain this tradition. They have a responsibility to pass it on, and they have a shared interest in kind of your individual success, and it's a kind of long-term, lifelong relationship in which they constantly support you through time. Whereas, your relationship most of the time with professors in universities, you take the class and you might take 2, maybe you get a reference letter, but that's about it. It's a kind of a very different kind of setting. But there are very good, intelligent people in both areas who can, if you know what you're looking for, you can benefit from both sides.
Sidi, you mentioned that there are 2 different ways to approach philosophy. We will also talk a lot about kalam. So when we say kalam, maybe most of you have an idea what kalam is. I don't think we should talk too much about definitions, and we can maybe shortly say it's like the science in Islamic tradition, which developed around the beliefs of the Muslims. So Muslims believe certain things, and the science which developed around these beliefs is ilm al-kalam, the science of kalam. You can of course add and say anything about definitions you want to. So there are you mentioned 2 different ways to approach it. One we see in many faculties for Islamic studies, like the historical one.
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is like more focused on the content and the argumentation. Can you give us like one example how Kalam investigates a certain question, for example, just to get an idea?
So, Ilm al-Kalam, as you just mentioned, investigates Islamic beliefs. So there's a way in which you can describe it as saying, Kalam is maybe the philosophy of Islam. So it's supposed to answer kind of some basic questions about what Muslims believe and why they believe them, why they take them to be true. And there's a way that you can study Ilm Kalam historically without ever asking the question of whether any of these beliefs are true or false, or whether any of these arguments are effective or not effective. You can just say, oh, look, for example, on the question of skepticism, they can say, well, the Mutakallimun said X, Y, and Z about skepticism, and
what is skepticism, maybe?
Skepticism is basically any philosophical position which believes that, say, all knowledge is not possible, or some, let's say, they can be limited kinds, some forms of knowledge are not possible.
Like the knowledge whether God exists or not.
For example,
you just can't answer.
I mean, there's some who'll tell you there's no knowledge at all. I mean, I don't know if I'm here right now. I don't know if you're here. I can't know anything. And then there's the restricted kinds where say I don't know anything. We can't know anything about, let's say, we can't know anything about metaphysics. We can't know anything about God. We can't know anything about
true, like what they say, letzte Wahrheit in German, like truth. Absolute truth. We are only like it's some kind of Bescheidenheit, like false humbleness. We are only human. We can't. We don't have access to real.
I mean,
truth.
Some skeptics are dogmatic as well. They say, look, there's absolutely nothing. There's so the point. There's different kinds, but these are. So someone might say, well, look, here's what Aristotle said about skepticism. 1, 2, 3, and Mutakallimun said. 1, 2, 3 about skepticism, and they try to compare if they added anything or subtracted or something like that, and that's it. They don't bother to ask, are these effective responses to skepticism?
They just say, this guy said this.
Yeah, but the problem is you can't really appreciate what they said unless you try to actually engage with those arguments and try to kind of tackle with them yourself, and then you'll discover a lot more. I mean, the same difference exists, even in the academy now as it exists here and other Western countries. They distinguish between, say, history of philosophy and history of ideas. So history of philosophy is basically philosophy just about texts in the past. And history of ideas is following, the evolution of an idea, who first came up with this and then who said something else. And so those people maybe are more interested in the ideas, like, say, conceptual history, or they're interested in the people, okay, you can study as a political philosopher Machiavelli's work and to see if it's, a viable political option, or you can study it and say, okay, why did Machiavelli write this work? Who were his friends? What were the purpose? The kind of looking at the historical context. And some people maybe even take that to the extent that, it's almost like ideas are purely the product of, a historical context, and it was to serve certain purposes. And maybe they imply even that, asking questions about whether it's true or false are not even valuable questions, because true or false are just words that we use to say what's, let's say, beneficial or what's serving our interests or something like that.
So you you mentioned it in Nebensatz. Like you said it, but maybe just to point it out again. So actually, it's not very good and scientific in the real meaning of the word when we just say when we just narrate what other people said about certain topics. If we want really become scholars and scientists and people who like really want to know what the truth is, we have to engage. We have to, and that's maybe also maybe like one thing which came to my mind. A big difference between kalam and fiqh, for example, because in fiqh you maybe need many background knowledge. You may need like different hadith and different methods before you can judge. That's why we are most of all every one of us are muqallids. We just take the opinion. But in kalam it's different, right? Because basically what we need is our reason in many occasions. Isn't it like this? Because, for example, it's a rational issue, it's a theoretical issue. So, for example, when a scholar says something about a topic, you mentioned skepticism, I don't have to accept just what's written there because it's written there because it's a great scholar who said it. I can engage in it, I can think about it, I can ask myself, do I find it convincing or not? Right?
Well, I mean, I would like to think that that kalam also requires you to do a bit of research, not just sit there and kind of say whatever you like. I mean, it's a science like any other science. You're going to have to study some more elementary texts and then move on to higher texts, and it will also require, you should have an awareness of the relevant evidence from the Quran and from the Hadith for what we're required to believe. So you can think of ilm al-kalam in the following way. You can say, look, from the fiqh al-akbar perspective, okay, there are things we're obliged to believe. It's wajib to believe a certain set of aqa'id. And there is a certain apparatus, usul al-fiqh, for example, through which, when applied to the evidence of the Quran and the Sunnah, we can derive somehow that we're required to believe, these beliefs, for example, some list of beliefs. That's a hukum shar'i about what you're required to believe. The mutakallim does this. And then they add to this evidence, okay, or they marshal the evidence to show why these beliefs are true, independently of whether they are obligatory.
Yes.
But of course, their main research, their main inquiry is into the beliefs that we are obligated to believe. There are plenty of things that are true out there, but we're not obligated to go and investigate why, we're required to know why they are true or not. But there is something, I guess, a bit different, because the primary aim of ilm al-kalam, at least for the individual, is for them to have an understanding of why they believe the things that they believe. It's not just because their parents believe them, or that because they're Turkish, or because they're Arab, or because they are from another Muslim majority country, because then you have to ask the question, well, why were their parents? And then you kind of eventually you have to find someone. It's like, oh, well, because it's true, because because of X, Y, and Z. That's what matters. And I think that's what makes someone's practice even easy for them. when often, let's say young people and human beings in general, they have difficulty doing things if they don't know why they have to do them. And so when you give them an understanding and they have a deeper understanding of why and why it's true, it's almost like they assimilate that authority in themselves. So they no longer need, like an authority figure in their life to tell them, you need to do this and you need to do that. They'll start doing their kind of source of authority is, or their motivation is now internalized. They don't need no longer other human beings to kind of tell them, and they don't need to complain or something and ask like why they have to do something. Well, they understand now why they have to do it. And they understand why it's good for them, and they understand why other people, should also do something like that. I'm not sure if that.
Yeah, I think so. And you also, I think, began to explain why someone should maybe engage with this science at all in the beginning. Yeah. So we can maybe talk a little bit about that. Like we mentioned that Kalam tries to prove also this set of beliefs. Yeah. I don't know if you guys also discuss sometimes. Maybe you can raise your hand. Have you discussed in the last maybe 2 or 3 weeks your beliefs with, for example, non-Muslim, where you wanted to show him that it makes sense what you believe, or isn't this something like you experienced? Like who did it in the last 2 or 3 weeks? Maybe anyone? Yeah, 1, 2. Yeah. Okay, some people. So most of us maybe do it once a year or even less times. So where's the benefit then? Because we see ourselves as Muslims and we see ourselves as convinced, for example. Where is the benefit of like studying Kalam texts, for example, for these kind of people?
Okay, so I think Ilm al-Kalam at different levels of expertise have different functions. And so there's a benefit for individuals, and there's a benefit for society, and there is a benefit, let's say, for scientific practice. And I'll try to explain each one briefly. So for the individual, as we kind of mentioned, I think every human being, by their own very nature, from a very young age, they have a desire to understand what's going on in the world, where they came from, where the world came from. Children ask these questions. And as people grow old, it's natural for them to want to ask and understand. And there's a certain tranquility that human beings can achieve when they understand or when they come to know certain truths. So Ilm al-Kalam has a benefit for the individual by allowing them to realize the aqa'id al-imaniyya, why they are true. They can achieve a better understanding of these aqa'id by understanding the very evidence for it or the proof for it. They even understand better what it is that they are believing. It becomes more precise for them. And they're able to resolve a lot of questions on their own, and they can help people around them, or they're raising their children or their family and so on. So it has this individual benefit. And that can be at a very basic level. It doesn't need to be, they don't need to become, a Imam al-Ash'ari or an Imam al-Razi or a Qadi Baqillani to achieve that. And then there is a social level where, let's say, people who are experts in this science, and they can be a kind of representatives of the Muslim community in their discussions with other communities, for example. And it's been the practice historically in Islam and now that there are scholars who would represent the Muslims in their discussions with scholars from other communities. And it was one of the common practices of many khulafa and salatin in the past, some who were scholars themselves and others who were not, but they would often bring together people to discuss. And so in that sense, you can say a mutakallim is almost like a mutakallim on behalf of his community. And then this practice of speaking to other communities and speaking to their leadership, of course, is also a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Many examples, including, let's say, the Prophet ﷺ invited the Christians of Najran to the masjid to have long discussions. Okay, so he didn't ask them to send, like not their leaders. Their leadership came to have those discussions, and just like he had discussions with many other, with the mushrikeen and so on. This is a practice. It's an important practice, important function. And I mean, even nowadays when we see, let's say, debates happen with, let's say, Christians or Jews or with atheists or something like that, we need people who can speak in a effective and learned and educated manner, in an authoritative manner, on behalf of their community. Because some people who know the aqa'id and they believe them and they know why they believe them and they're not just blindly following their parents or something, but they have other responsibilities or they don't have the same abilities to speak on behalf of their community or speak with others in an effective way. And one last benefit is when I said it's a scientific one. So when we look at the construction of the Islamic sciences, let's say علم الفقه, أصول الفقه, علم التفسير, علم الحديث, علم التصوف, they have let's say, branch questions, particular questions, and they have axioms, they have principles, higher principles. Each one of these sciences doesn't prove its first principles. Okay, the faqih, for example, he takes for granted that there is prophethood, there is Quran, there is Sunnah. Isma is taken for granted. He doesn't have to prove Isma in order to derive rulings. His job is to derive rulings. Faqih in the strict sense, as in the mujtahid. His job, his task is to derive the rulings from the kitab and the sunnah. His task as a faqih is not to prove the existence of God or to prove the truth of prophethood or tawatur al-Quran or أن خبر الواحد يفيد الظن ويوجب العمل. That's not his task. Those are taken for granted. Those are established by someone in usul al-fiqh, for example, some of these principles. And some of those principles of usul al-fiqh, they're proven by the mutakallim. So ilm al-kalam looks at the most general things, and from these most general principles that he proves, the mutakallim, those are then the axioms for the other Islamic sciences. So every science has certain kind of principles that are taken as axiomatic, and those axioms are proven in kalam, and kalam is the most basic science in that sense because it doesn't take its axioms from another science. And that's why the mutakallim has to investigate things like epistemology and how we know things, and what are the most basic and fundamental kinds of knowledge. They investigate from refuting skepticism all the way to speaking about sense perception and first principles and the basic structure of knowledge, and then they pass on those principles to other sciences. And in fact, they even provided axioms for the natural sciences as well. So it's not just for the specific Islamic sciences, but also for the natural sciences, because the Muslims and the Islamic civilization could no longer simply when you build your own civilization, you have to build and construct the sciences yourself. You can't just wait around for someone else to do it for you and then figure out how you're going to integrate it into your belief system every time someone else, comes up with a new idea. No, it's actually offering a distinct and fully fledged alternative for how even we should study, let's say, physics or biology or something like that. And if you think so I mean, there's concrete examples for this. I mean, they offered theories. They didn't want to go into all the details of the physical theories. That's not what they're interested in. But they asked some basic fundamental questions about matter and why matter, because they're interested, let's say, in showing that the world is created. Okay, so you have basic argument, dalil huduth, the argument from the createdness or the origination of the world. The first premise is that the world began to exist. They need to prove this. So they need to have a theory of what the world is, because this is the subject of the proposition. Okay, so what's the world? And then why should it be hadith? So they need to investigate the world at least to the extent that they can sufficiently show that this is, for it's true. And then the second premise, that every hadith or everything that began to exist has a cause, is, let's say, another metaphysical discussion about nature of cause and nature of effect and so on. I mean, not everyone has to do this. Everyone has certain kind of basic intuitions about this. Everyone knows that things don't happen without a reason, except some philosophers, for example, who, can figure out ways of how to avoid or limit these types of principles. But there's somebody who has to deal with those kinds of questions. So those are the kind of general areas, or the three kind of areas of benefit from that one could benefit from ilm al-kalam. So a kind of scientific role, a social role, and an individual role. Wallahu a'lam.
If you have any direct questions, you can also always raise your hand, and if you want to ask a separate question, you can leave it for the end.
It's just a question that has been bothering me a long time. Do you think any of these modern thoughts or arguments are truly unique? Because as I've, in my experience, just reading or knowing about the past scholars, none of the arguments nowadays are truly unique or have not already been solved from the past scholars. So my question is just what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Can I repeat the question for the microphone? The brother asked if any of the new current questions or problems or issues are unique, not found in previous discussions. Are there really any new and unique issues, right?
Yeah, about the past 2 centuries, I would say.
Right. I mean, oftentimes you'll find that even if it's not the exact same question, it's a kind of new version of an old question. And so one of the advantages of actually studying ilm al-kalam, which is also a historically informed science, okay? They don't pretend like they just appeared out of nowhere. No, there's a kind of long history. They're keeping a log. They're keeping a record of all of the dialogues that they've had in the past, so that they, if there's a question that appears, they'll say, well, let's see, do we have this on file or not? If we do, okay, then there's a way to deal with it. And what it does is that it gives the kind of, especially one who has studied it, they are no longer so easily, let's say, impressed or surprised, or they're kind of all prepared for most of the questions or the objections that can be made. In fact, maybe they can, if they really wanted to, they could tell him, actually, you could make your objection a lot stronger if you said this or this, because this is something that someone had already discussed. So yeah, I think that's true, and I think being acquainted with that is very edifying, I think, for for the individual who studies it.
I have also a question online. One could ask if Kalam is of benefit for individuals to convince themselves of the truth, why did the first Muslims not study this science?
I mean, I think the first Muslims did study the science, so I don't concede the premise of the question. Interesting. I mean, there's a I believe in the Kitab al-Qanun by a late Moroccan scholar named Al-Hassan al-Yusi. Qanun was a book that he wrote, a taxonomy of the sciences. So he basically collected discussions on all the sciences that were studied at his time at that. So including from all the way from grammar to mathematics to kalam to fiqh, every possible science that you can possibly imagine that they knew of at that time, he collected discussions about them in this book. Each one he brought forth a kind of definition of that science, what that science studies, who were the first people who wrote books in that science, what are the kind of most important texts in that science. And when he came to and as you guys know, when you begin a study of science, they'll tell you the 10 principles of the science, and they want to say about what's the definition, and who's the wada, and what's the mawdu', and what's the fa'ida, and what are the masail. So when he spoke about ilm al-kalam, he said something like, قِيلَ وَاضِعُهُ أبو الحسن الأشعري. He's the wada', the kind of first or the kind of main early authority who wrote in the science. Okay? And he said that this is actually not true. The wada' of the science is Allah Ta'ala, okay? Because the science is found in the Quran. The Quran has arguments that show that the world are the signs of God. And those who reflect on the world know that God exists, God is one, God is wise, God is knowing, God is powerful. And those people who know and reflect, they say, مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا. So there are also arguments against other faiths. There's arguments against Christians. There's arguments against Jews. There's arguments against polytheists. There are arguments that happen through dialogues of Anbiya with their people. And they are not telling them, they don't tell their people, they're not making reference to themselves and an authority. They don't say, I'm a prophet, I'm ma'soom, you have to listen to me. That's not how they argue with them. They tell them, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam told them, like, why do you worship idols that have no effect, no authority? Why would you worship the sun? Let's see, could the sun be God? Could the sun be the creator of the world? Well, the sun undergoes changes. It sets and it rises. It's under the control of somebody else. He has an argument with a king who says, who's this creator that you're speaking of? He is the one who gives life and he gives death. He says, I give life and I give death. He didn't get it. Okay, so he didn't understand. So there was a slight wedge. So he said, he brings the sun from the east, so bring it from the west. فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ. And all of the aqa'id are mentioned, and the beliefs regarding the prophets and so on, and the arguments for resurrection, for example, the possibility of resurrection. The mushrikeen say, مَنْ يُحْيِي الْعِظَامَ وَهِيَ رَمِيمٌ. How could this possibly happen? This is a violation of everything that we know. And
what does it mean in German?
Who will bring back the bones after they've turned to dust? قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم. So in these ayat, these are isharat to what are the main evidences for this. When you actually look carefully and you study ilm al-kalam, you realize that most of, if not all of the arguments, the main kind of structure is taken directly from the kitab and from the sunnah. Even arguments, Lucy, I think he even mentioned the ibtal al-tasalsul, for example, the refutation of infinite regress, for example, and so on. They are developing these ideas and articulating them for different contexts. And they're also careful to make sure that we distinguish between what is actually known, what we know about the world, and how we articulate the world. So I can tell you, I can divide up the world into a kind of technical, or let's say philosophical way, okay? So I can tell you the world is jawahir and a'rab, atomic substances and their properties, okay? These are kind of the fundamental things that comprise the world. I can also tell you something else. I can tell you the world is a samawati wal ard. So I've used two different concepts, but what I am talking about, the extension, the kind of set of all objects that I'm talking about, is the same things. I can describe them in one way and I can describe them in another way. And a wise person or a prudent person should offer a description which is relevant and appropriate to the context that they are in. So I can say the world is all, plants, animals, and minerals, or inanimate objects and animate beings, or something like that. And then I can say, I can identify other properties about animate things to show that they are in need of a creator, and inanimate things, why they can't explain themselves, and so on. There isn't like one way of doing it. And so a person, depending on their background, depending on their context, whether they're from the early Muslim community or Muslim community in Osnabrück or something, they should have an understanding which is closest to, what is most effective in communicating those same ideas. So, like I said again, like the world is created, you can then kind of explain that and offer details to the statement in a way which is appropriate to your context. But I think every Muslim, whether they're from the early community or not, they believe that the world is created and that God created the world. They weren't, and they had reasons for that, and they looked and they reflected on the signs that are available to them, and that's basically what it is. Allahu alam.
Yeah, I think we are also like doing, it's of course a general talk, so just to not fall into the issue that we just talk about kalam and not do kalam, maybe we can also like go into one or two examples, like what the mutakallim also wants to like defend the Islamic aqaid. What threats do you see, for example, in current discussions or in current times? Maybe we don't have this problems, these false beliefs, but maybe it can be a danger, because everything which is discussed, for example, among certain people or in academia, after some time, it can switch to the general population. For example, you talked about skepticism. I think before it was more like a philosophical discussion, and then the general population also became influenced by it. And so, what are, for example, like certain dangers or problems we are facing now, or maybe we could face in future?
So, I guess the question is about individual belief. What would be, it seems that, I haven't really done too much, in-depth, let's say, statistical research on this question. Others have. But I get the sense that most of the questions that young Muslims struggle with, especially those who live in the West, but also by virtue of the globalization and the kind of export of Western knowledge systems to the Islamic world as well, and all of the kind of radical changes that have happened over the past 2 centuries. I would say a lot of questions have to do with, let's say, contemporary morals and ethics, and how people view them as being in conflict with the ahkam al-sharia. And so they either will take a route where they'll say, you know, this is unacceptable and we need to kind of radically reform everything. Or some people just say, well, you know, this can't be true or something like this because it's in violation of some other ethical norms that they took to be true. I mean, this could be even, you know, someone might have a belief that, you know, let's say the death penalty is immoral. You know, this is just something bad and no one should allow the death penalty. The Sharia allows for the death penalty or commands the death penalty, then, you know, this is a problem. You know, the Sharia is either wrong, in which case, and if it's wrong, then how could it be from God? Yani, can't be, you know. Or they'll say, you know, we need to kind of radically change it, and I think people are aware of similar kinds of issues, and of course there's also a lot of pressure internationally. You know, there's many kind of organizations, they get a lot of money and their job is basically to promote certain you know, belief systems amongst certain, you know, communities and states, which they find to, you know, that they need to kind of catch up with the times and so on. And there's always people who are convinced by that, and they're convinced by it because of certain philosophical presuppositions that they haven't really reflected on themselves. And it's going to be based on what they understand the human being to be. Some basic understanding of what they think a human being is, whether that human being has certain natural rights and responsibilities, whether certain actions or normative judgments are, you know, rational absolutes, whether, you know, even from within the Islamic views themselves on this question, like whether, according to some, you know, heterodox views, whether, you know, God is obligated to have certain judgments. There are some, you know, even early Mu'tazila who were dumbfounded by the idea of animal sacrifice, for example. They thought it was just, it had, you know, they would say, like, if it wasn't that the Sharia said that this was okay, we would have said with our uqul that this was bad, okay? But there's others who said, no, I mean, this is the uqul, and this is a misuse of the uqul. Actually, there's no rational evidence that would indicate that this is, let's say, bad or immoral or good. But those are things that need to be investigated, and I think those questions still, a lot of those questions still apply today. I mean, some people will say, look, I take it as axiomatic that, you know, men and women are absolutely equal, and the Sharia distinguishes an inheritance between men and women. This is wrong. Okay, so it has to be changed, or, I mean, this is something that I can't accept. So where does this come from? This comes from a presupposition that they have a certain idea of what a human being is. What, you know, what does it mean to, let's say, be a man or a woman in their role in society, and whether that role should be, whether that role justifies or doesn't justify certain differences in other legal or social practices. And it's often, what I find is that it's these kinds of questions that people have issues with. There are some people also who think that, let's say, you know, there's no, let's say, evidence for the truth of Islam, or there can't be any evidence, let's say, for the existence of God. It's something that you just kind of believe. And because there's no evidence for it, is because there's no proof for it, it can't be something that you build a society on. Okay, so you want to build a society on something which everyone believes is true, it's strong, it's authoritative, that you should obey it or something like that. So they want to kind of, let's say, structure society in another way. I mean, I know I've spoken a bit vaguely, but I would just categorize them generally as in two categories. I would say that there is a pressure coming from the domain of, let's say, of morality and ethics and norms, which contradict the ahkam sharia. So they think that these are from reason and these are kind of absolutes, and I don't know, the Geneva Conventions or the United Nations says, or UNESCO or something like this. And then another set is that they believe, let's say, the natural sciences today conflict with, Muslim beliefs about, let's say, miracles or about God or about angels or something like that. And so I would say that's slightly less, but it's there. And I would say a lot of people, mostly they're, if there are challenges, then they're usually from these two areas. And I think even a very rudimentary study of kalam and distinguishing a metaphysical or a rational judgment from a normative judgment and from an empirical or nomological judgment, or what does it mean for there to be like a scientific law? Are these kind of rational metaphysical absolutes that couldn't possibly be violated, or are these generalizations about regularities we observe and that they are subject to violation, not least by the one who has put them in place to begin with? So I think a lot of those kind of confusions could easily be resolved to the extent that even if that it would at the very least, it would clarify the discussion such that the person, before they make a kind of drastic decision, they understand what exactly they are, let's say, accepting or rejecting. And oftentimes it's easy for them, if they aren't aware of this science or aware of this understanding, for them to dismiss what their parents' generation was doing when they first arrived here, and now they know better because they've studied here in university or something like that. So I think those are the two kind of general areas. Yeah.
Just regarding the ethical one. So usually in Kalam books, there is this whole section about tahsin and taqbih, for example, like discussing who has the right to decide, for example, what is good and what is bad, which actions. And usually, we prove that, of course, like the ratio, the what do we say, the aql, like the rational faculty, can't know what God is pleased with and not pleased with. Usually it's said like this. So God is the only one who can give us wahy, revelation about what is in absolute manner good and bad, meaning what will be rewarded in the afterlife, or not rewarded, the other thing, punished, yes. So sometimes in this question, for example, we prove it rationally, but there remains we have emotionally problems still with some of them. I don't want to get cancelled online, but for example, I don't know, like beating children when they don't pray or anything. There are some ahkam which contradict to the I don't even want to say Western socialization, but which seem to be, for example, sometimes not very with rahma or with compassion. Yeah. So, okay, we prove it rationally. God is the one who can judge, and we can't. But sometimes there remains like this kind of issue not being able to accept it. So, what should someone do in this case?
I mean, I'm not sure what you mean not able to accept it exactly. So, I mean, somebody may have some, just a kind of visceral reaction to something.
Visceral, what does it mean?
Like a kind of emotional
Okay.
So, for example, I like the example of animal slaughter. I mean, somebody might say, look, I have no problem with animal slaughter. I like to eat meat. But if you take them in Eid al-Adha, if you go out with them to the farm, they have nightmares the next day and they freak out and they don't, they can't see blood or something like that.
Okay.
Or maybe they just, their heart breaks when they see the sheep or the camel or whatever it is. I mean, that's just a kind of, nobody has to do everything. I mean, if it's just a kind of emotional or let's say a psychological difficulty, it's not a kind of moral, rational objection. I mean, these are two different kinds of problems that would require two different kinds of responses, I would say. And in fact, I mean, just being able to make the distinction between the two is very important. So, and this works the other way around as well. So, not just for bad things, but even for good things. So suppose, you're just walking down the street and you see like an old lady fall, okay? It doesn't, almost anyone, just the way that human beings are made is that they'll automatically want to go and help this person and, help them get up and see if they need anything else. It's just almost like a natural disposition. Okay, الرقة النوعية, as some of the متكلمون call it, and this can happen to. So if somebody does it, even a good thing, out of not even out of some rational conviction or some sort of reasoning, I think that's a different. It's not necessarily something we'll say is this like an absolute, rationally knowable good, or is this a kind of, someone might give you a more natural psychological explanation of it. It seems that when we look more carefully at a lot of these cases, which often seem very black and white in the beginning, end up being a little bit more complicated. And I think a lot of people, once they think about it a little bit, they begin to appreciate the value of having these kinds of discussions. Does that help with your question?
Yeah, I think it helps.
I talked to someone once exactly about this topic. The question of the person was, why did Allah create like animals that are being brutally killed by other animals and they don't even affect us? So, to be honest, I didn't know what to answer her, and so I wanted to ask you maybe.
So these kinds of why questions are interesting. So there's.
Can you?
So the question was, somebody asked, this is a kind of micro question application of the general problem of evil. So why does evil exist? But the specifics of the question is, why did God create some animals which are only kind of brutally killed by other animals? I mean, why do people enjoy watching that on the National Geographic documentaries? That's another interesting question. A lot of people seem to find it very fascinating, to say the least. But I think there's general answers, and then there's kind of more specific ones. But I mean, having some kind of, let's say, experience with some of these issues, you can kind of bring the question away from its specific details, and you can say, look, well, what's the general form of the objection here? When someone asks, why are there some bad things? We can say the way that a Muslim sees these things is that this is in a kind of an ephemeral world. This is
Ephemeral?
a dar al-imtihan. This is, I mean, it's a temporary state. We're tested with good things just as we are tested with bad things. And bad things exist. And the fact is that we are the ones who are going to be questioned. We're not going to be questioning God. So there are people who kind of offer the question seeking understanding as a believer, and there are people who offer the question and it's actually not a question, but it's actually an objection of saying, for example, evil exists. If evil exists, then God does not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. This is not a question about why. So a believer may ask, why does this exist? And you may tell him, لا يسأل عما يفعل وهم يسألون, something like this. You can tell him, actually, that this is the world of, let's say, tests and tribulations, and people, and even some will say even animals will actually be tried. There are such that, there's a hadith, most of them, they don't take it literally, but they say it's a kinaya, that every slight action is going to be taken into account. So all wrongs will be written, and all perfect justice will be served, and that can only be served by the being who knows all things and who knows the things that we don't know. But ultimately, let's say for the answer from the Ash'ari's perspective is that Allah Ta'ala is free to create such things, and human beings are not in a position to offer those kinds of, let's say, objections or conditions, like, I won't believe unless you kind of change the furniture around here. I want kind of nicer animal species that are kind of nicer to each other, or something like this. These are not kind of wrong, like they're questions that have certain presuppositions that we would need to go and question about the universality or the kind of rational value of these goods and bads. Like, what do they amount to? Does it amount to simply like, I feel bad when I see some pain or something like that? Is pain intrinsically evil? Is it intrinsically good? It seems that some pains may be good. Maybe we want to feel pain. If you didn't feel pain, maybe you wouldn't be able to react properly to your situation, and so on. These aren't things that have a kind of obvious moral judgment attached to them. And in general, of course, we also believe that even though Allah Ta'ala is not obligated to make the world according to our own desires, but we also believe that there are, let's say, hidden wisdoms and hidden benefits. There's always some sort of a wisdom, some sort of a benefit, even when we are unable to discern it, without that wisdom or that benefit being something obligatory on God. This is from Mahd al-Karam, from his pure generosity.
And there are many questions now, and also online. Should we just take?
How about you, Yani, in the green vest?
Just about the last mention you made about there being hidden wisdoms in all things Allah created and how He created them. I heard this phrase often in talks and so on, but how can we prove of this being the case? Is it a Quranic principle, or does it go back to the Sunnah of the Prophet?
Yeah, so I would say that's that Allah Ta'ala is al-Hakim, and that there are, let's say, benefits. That these are general dictates that are found, I think, in the Quran. and in the hadith. But of course, I mean, there's also there's a lot of so in my answer, I gave the basic principle, which is لا يسأل عما يفعل وهم يسألون. This is a basic principle, and this kind of says, this is a statement of our position, the human being's position as abd in this world. And if someone wants to kind of speak as though they are a Rabb and that they are a judge, that they're the ones ready to judge Allah Ta'ala, despite the fact that they are, deficient being with extremely limited knowledge and who don't simply have any of the properties, the attributes that would allow them to be such a judge. I think in such a situation, you kind of have to, if you want to be thorough, you kind of have to go back a few steps. You can just ask some certain basic questions about, like, well, is there evidence for the existence of a creator? If there is evidence, then the question of evil ends up being a question of how we need to deal with it, not whether or not it's evidence for and against, let's say, the existence of God. I mean, I don't see any strong evidence at all that suggests evil is a negation, nor does the Quran claim there's no evil in the world. Bil'aks, the Quran says there's lots of bad things that happen in the world, and there's death, and there's sickness, and that this is a life of tribulation and tests. And it's our task when it comes to the spiritual side of dealing with, let's say, evil. This is about cultivating virtues of patience, of humility, of hope in Allah Ta'ala's compassion and justice, and that's kind of how we would deal with the issue on the personal level. But at simply the rational level, I mean, Allah Ta'ala is free to create what He wills and to test us as He sees fit. It doesn't do you any good to say, well, I don't want to do this because I think that it should be otherwise. I think that person has misunderstood their own reality and their own role in the system. Wallahu a'lam. I mean, I'm not, does that, I mean, there at the end of the day, there's some very difficult questions at the end of the day that believers have to come to face with. Judgment is not a joke at the end of the day, and we ask Allah husn al-khatimah fi nihaya.
Is the moral segment irrelevant if I just like speak from the rational standpoint? If you just prove that God exists and He's all wise and all knowing and all just, then that just means the moral set is just completely irrelevant, because our understanding of morals is not relevant compared to the understanding of what Allah has created in total. So is the moral state of the discussion can we just leave it out in general? Because if you just prove God's existence and just say, okay, He's omnipotent and He's all-knowing, He's vast, He has infinite amounts of knowledge more than us, then is this even relevant, the moral standpoint?
I mean, some people will tell you, yeah, it is definitely relevant. I mean, there are some schools within Islamic thought who believe that the goodness and badness of things is independent of God's will. And so, God has certain obligations towards humankind. There are some people who believe that. But those are things that need to be engaged about, like how, if someone wants to be a moral realist or not. and what are the limitations to that kind of a view or not. And the mutakallimun and the usuliyun as well, who also investigated these questions about what they call tahsin and taqbih or husn and qubah, is they usually divide it into 3 different kinds of categories. So they'll say one category of good and bad is a kind of agent-dependent category. Whether the agent is a group or an individual, it doesn't matter, but it's a kind of, so for example, you have a business, you lose money, you say this is bad. You make money, you say this is good. Is it good for the trees? Is it good for other human beings? Is it good for the planet Mars or something? It doesn't seem to be good in an absolute or a moral way. It's a kind of pragmatic, agent goal-based, good for you kind of goods, okay? And there is another kind of good or bad which comes down to, let's say, pain and pleasure or something like this. Things which are or harmful and beneficial for people. You can kind of include that in the other category as well. Maybe actually consider that single category. The second category of good and bads are things like, this is a good car, this is a bad car. This car, is, it has a lot of defects, and this is a good car, it's functioning correctly. So not insofar as they are beneficial or harmful, but insofar as they vary in degrees of perfection and deficiency. And these are 2 categories which are very kind of interrelated, because obviously things which have perfections obviously are more beneficial, and things which are defective, usually they have less, and they kind of, let's say, harmful or so on. Of course, it's not absolute, right? So you can say this is a good fighter jet, for example. It's not good if you're being attacked by it, but you can look at it, let's say, independently in its kind of design structure or something like that. But then the third category is where there is disagreement on, and that is, do volitional actions carry an independent moral value such that reason alone determines that we should praise someone for performing a good action and blame them for performing a bad action, and that performing good actions are deserving of reward and bad actions are deserving of punishment. Now, there could be a way that someone conceives of this in a limited practical sense. So you want to organize a society and you want to create punishments and rewards to make sure people follow your rules, and this ends up falling into the first category, of some things which are beneficial and harmful practically for your agent, which is now the entire society. You're taking kind of, let's say, the general good. But then the question you have to ask is, and so maybe someone, for example, the Ash'a'ira, who they don't accept absolute universal moral goods of the third category. They accept the first, they accept the second, and they might say, look, the third that you guys have confused to be some sort of absolute morals are actually, let's say, relative to a human society or one human society, and maybe it differs about how general you want to go. So people, after the Second World War, when they drafted, let's say, the UN Declaration, they tried to take into consideration, let's say, how can we have, let's say, a system of rules where we take all of humanity into consideration. And then it ends up being a question of application. Okay, you guys all agreed to this, but actually you're seeming to apply it in such a way that you're actually only taking a subset of those people into consideration when you are applying them. The crux comes to, okay, let's say we accept, even though this is dubious, but let's say we accept that, sure, there are certain norms that human beings kind of all agree to and they should all apply, at least with respect to the first category. Okay, that these are general benefits and general harms. We know we don't want to live in a society where you're allowed to kill your neighbor or something. I mean, even if you didn't have a moral stance, you're just like, I don't want to get stabbed by my neighbor, for example. You don't need to be like a kind of philosopher or something like that to understand these kind of basic things. But the question is, are they universal? Are these things that pertain to human beings universal? Do they pertain also to God, for example? If I, do something nice for my neighbor, is it obligatory? Does God have to praise me and reward me for doing something like that, or not? And if I do something bad, is it obligatory that God must punish? And on this basis, for example, some of the early Mu'tazila, they denied the shifa. They said, how can it be that God forgives people without doing tawbah by virtue of shifa or something else? That would be unjust. They must be punished, for example. Because they believe that these things have a kind of, for metaphysical reasons and other reasons, they believe that these had a kind of independent moral value, which is binding on all rational agents, human beings and God alike. I see you're unhappy with the...
I just can't comprehend that the very concept.
Zu viele Nachfragen auch.
Ja.
Also es gibt noch andere Nachfragen. Barakallahu fik, Sidi. I don't know if
Well,
you...
timer.
It's 9:30. Maybe like some questions about different topics and then we can end it. There were some questions also regarding the study of Kalam. For example, sometimes the claim is being made that studies of Kalam today are too loaded with historical topics, like only found in the books, not relevant today. Is the benefit of historical awareness and implicit preparation for possible upcoming issues enough of a justification to keep studying these dead issues?
Can I just see here? I guess that's a bit of a difficult question, but I would say that the practitioners of the science, the ones who are doing the science well, they should have an awareness of what's going on in the world around them, and they should be able to distinguish between questions which are important to spend a lot of time on, and which questions are not. I mean, a question may be dead at some time and it may come back at another time. So I think depending on the level of study, for someone who really wants to become just a full-time expert, there isn't any questions that are, let's say, useless or that shouldn't be studied. But I think probably a judgment call needs to be made by teachers and students of the science, given their context and given the level that they are discussing. I mean, I think probably the questioner had something more specific in mind, but they didn't say what it was, so I can't really speak to that exactly. But I'm sure, you have to exercise some sort of prudence. I mean, the same thing applies for fiqh. When you're teaching fiqh here, there's certain masail that most people don't need to know about. They don't need to have any understanding of it. I mean, if you start talking to them about it, it might end up making no sense. Like, okay, does the average Muslim in Osnabrück need to know what zakat to pay on their goats or their sheep or something like that? Someone who has a farm and animals should know, but most people don't have. So, is it like a dead issue? It might only be relevant to some people and not others. So these are kind of judgment calls that need to be made by people in the relevant context.
And maybe also when we watch people who use these terms, sometimes use it too fast and too inflationally. They say this is a dead issue, that's a dead issue. without really, first
Yeah,
of all,
I mean, you need to-
atomism, that atomism is dead.
You need to prove that it's a dead
Yeah,
issue,
yeah,
really.
yeah.
I mean, let's say even on atomism, I mean, the matter is either continuous or it's discrete. There's no middle option. So,
Another question regarding the tradition or the. Do you think that Sunni Kalam can profit from Western philosophy and incorporate some arguments in the system of Sunni Kalam? And do you have examples for this? Or do you think that Sunni Kalam is like pretty much complete in that sense? It doesn't need it.
yeah, so Ilm al-Kalam, insofar as let's say insofar as Sunni Kalam, what is the mu'tamad? What are the kind of agreed upon positions of what we believe? These are, of course, kind of already established. The evidence is the arguments, the kind of new questions. These are all, let's say, subject to some degree of updates given contemporary developments. That doesn't mean that there's going to be some sort of major structural change. But in general, al-hikmah dalat al-mu'min, and there could be things to benefit from Western philosophy or modern science or Eastern philosophy, or there could be things to benefit from the least expected place. So, especially in something like Kalam, there are certain questions where there's only like 2 or 3 possible options you could have. And so you'll find people who agree on these very general questions who are not Muslims. And you may find debates that happen between Muslim schools themselves. You look in, let's say, the Western tradition, you'll find that they're having the exact same debate, or a kind of analogous debate that they're having on a question. If you want an example, I'll give you one example, very kind of obscure example, and even if it can be very beneficial. Let's say there's a debate on knowledge that happened between the Mu'tazila and the Asha'ira, say 900 years ago, whether knowledge was a type of belief or whether knowledge was a different kind of property, a different kind of mental state. So is there just human beings, they have beliefs, and then belief plus some other properties, that some beliefs are knowledge and some beliefs are, let's say, just an opinion, and some beliefs are ignorance or something like that. The Mu'tazila believed knowledge was a kind of belief, and so knowledge, the haqiqah of knowledge is i'tiqad. And the Ash'ari said, no, i'tiqad is not, ilm is not a kind of i'tiqad. And they had a certain debate, and this has certain consequences, even if they're not obvious, okay? It's an obscure one. Now, if you read contemporary Western philosophy, especially of the last 30, 40 years in epistemology, you will find for 30 years or something, they were basically debating whether knowledge was a belief or not. And oftentimes the objections and arguments from both sides were very, very similar to things that you'll find between Muslims. So if you're a Mu'tazili and you want to defend the belief account, you can go and read some people and be like, oh, that's good, I can use this. And if you're an Ash'ari, you can say, oh, that's also very interesting on the side, which is attacking the belief view, and this has certain kind of advantages, and I can kind of update my own view in light of that, or I can even, let's say, look at some new objections and offer an answer on from my perspective. And so there could be things that they don't have any obvious. These aren't things that are going to make you a Muslim or a kafir or a mubtada or something like this. But it's still something that could be benefited. Similar views on existence, shay'iyat al-ma'doom. You'll find a lot of views that repeat themselves, as we mentioned already in history. Yes?
Since I came here late, so I don't know if you already answered some questions on skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
I read your paper on typologies of skepticism, and I want to ask if would it be a very big exaggeration to say that skepticism in some form is the basis of all modern and postmodern philosophies. That would be the first question. And the second, should scholars of today just repeat all questions, all the answers to skepticism, or are there some new challenges? And would you teach these topics to people who have nothing to do with theology?
Yeah, well, so it's three great questions. So the paper was about philosophical forms of skepticism. So there's a kind of common sense or everyday usage of the term skepticism, which is not philosophical skepticism. You know, Schultz gives a speech about doing something like, I'm skeptical of what he's saying, okay? Like you're suspicious. But philosophical skepticism is a kind of philosophical position, and I discussed some of the, like, 5 or 6, I don't remember now exactly, different schools that are discussed in the Kalam tradition. And I think for students today, you know, whether I think we need to distinguish when it comes to the prevalence of skepticism today. Okay, so I would say that there could be a lot of skepticism about certain questions in the general culture. And some of those you may find in philosophy departments, but the philosophical forms of skepticism, at least the unrestricted kinds, the kind of extreme forms, you'll be very hard pressed to find someone in a philosophy department today who holds those kinds of views. It's a very small number of people who are like an inadi, like an absolute nihilist, like nothing exists. Okay, even I don't exist right now, and my statement, it's all, you know, pure illusion. Like you won't find someone who believes that. You won't find someone who's an absolute agnostic. They may be agnostic about 1 or 2 things. That's not the kind of indiyya that's discussed in the works of Kalam, who say, I don't know whether something is true, and I don't know whether I don't know, wa halumma jarra, and so on. Okay, like these kinds of people who are absolute agnostics, they don't exist. And let's say somebody who is, this was the la adriya. So that there's the indiyya who say everything is relative. You know, this might be more common to some extent in the general culture and maybe comp lit departments or something like that. But someone who wants to be an absolute relativist, let's say in a philosophy department nowadays, I think it's actually not so common. And some of them, you know, don't even think it's an important question because it doesn't have any practical benefit. Someone says, oh, I'm an absolute relativist, but then they go ahead and live their lives as if they're not a relativist at all. So some people are even skeptical about the benefits of these kinds of questions. But there's limited forms of skepticism. There could be people who are skeptical about the ability of human beings to know metaphysical truths, or let's say they're skeptical about whether we can know anything about whether God exists or not. And those aren't necessarily, they could or they could not be, let's say, principled forms of skepticism. They could just be, it happens to be the case that this person says we don't know, but they're not saying that it's impossible to know. I mean, these are kind of important distinctions. And you may find a lot of people, let's say in philosophy of religion departments or otherwise, who may say those about limited questions, but I'm not sure I would call that per se a skeptic in the stronger sense of the kind of deeper philosophical skepticism. And those can be dealt with by simply offering the evidence. I don't need to make an argument with those restricted forms or very limited forms of skepticism by offering a general argument for the possibility of knowledge. I can just say, well, here's some knowledge. And if this argument works, then I both prove the conclusion and I prove that it's possible, because the strongest evidence for possibility is that it actually happened. So, like wuqu' is the strongest evidence of imkan, actually. So I think any extreme forms are not common. I don't want to say they don't exist at all, but they're just not very common. There are kind of limited forms, and they may or may not be a kind of absolute, they might not be a principled form of skepticism. Number two, the second question was whether we should just repeat the same answers. I think even to repeat the same answers is a very difficult thing to do, because there are, the people that we're reading were extremely intelligent people who, chose their words very, very carefully. And oftentimes we repeat answers without even having a deep appreciation of what they're really saying. So I think even the question, should we just repeat? You shouldn't repeat anything if you're just repeating it. You should really try to study what they're saying carefully and try to understand what they're saying carefully. And you may discover in let's say, reading new versions, or contemporary versions of people talking about skepticism, you may be able to appreciate different aspects of what they were saying in the past. Okay, so and in fact, relating to skepticism is the question I just referred to previously about whether knowledge is a belief or not. It's not obvious, but actually, when you say knowledge is not a kind of belief, this is actually an anti-skeptical position. Because what happens if you take the belief view is that you can have a belief plus other conditions, but logically it's still possible for it to be false. So actually, logically, even if effectively no, there's still an opening for a philosophical form of skepticism. But if you say knowledge is actually a basic property which is factive, then it's impossible for it to be false, actually. Philosophically, it's impossible, such that it's a logical impossibility, even a metaphysical impossibility for knowledge, for you to have knowledge of P and for P not to be the case. But that's not the case for knowledge. So actually, even though it seems like some other kind of question, if you read it in some abwab of usul al-fiqh, or you read it in some abwab of kalam, and you might not know its connection to skepticism, but actually maybe it does have a deeper connection to skepticism. I would even maybe just add, skepticism is still discussed in philosophy today as a philosophical puzzle, not as people are actually skeptic and I don't know whether I exist or something like that, but philosophers are interested in what is the kind of, how should we resolve this, and what does that tell us about the nature of knowledge and human understanding and stuff like that. So it can be instructive for other reasons. The purpose of it is not to refute, absolute forms of skepticism or external world skepticism, but maybe it'll tell us something about perception. Maybe it'll tell us something about knowledge. And people who are interested in that kind of thing, it's beneficial, even if it nevertheless doesn't have, let's say, it doesn't need to be used to refute someone or resolve someone's deep doubts about whether they actually exist or something like that. You had a third.
Would you teach it awam?
So I would discuss some forms because what's awam? What's awam? Like everybody today has at least a high school education. And most of them have gone to university, and they're subject to all kinds of different philosophies and beliefs and full detailed studies in all other sciences, which may or not be in conflict with our beliefs. And somehow this is like okay, and like parents are proud. Oh, my son got the degree from so on. Then it becomes he ends up having. Or she ends up having, problems with their aqidah. It's not something that should be, that's confusing goods of the first category for absolute goods or something like this, right? And a lot of people, I would say even first year philosophy undergrads, they begin as kind of like skeptics or something like that, and then their first year philosophy professor turns them into dogmatic kinds of people who are very anti-skeptical. But I think there are a lot of popular beliefs out there where people think that, oh, you know, we're Muslims and we believe in Islam, but you know, there isn't like a real way to really know for sure or prove that Islam is true, and they makes very basic kind of skeptical arguments. Oh, disagreement indicates incapacity to reach the truth or something, even though this doesn't follow logically. Disagreement could just mean, let's say, is difficult, or people have ulterior motives, or there are a bunch of other kinds of considerations that human makes in their decision makings and their commitments that they make. Okay, and I think it is beneficial for people to understand those kind of questions, even if not to convince others, but also to realize, like, oh wait, it's possible, you know, for someone to have knowledge, because there's, you know, the general culture, I would say, is more skeptical. As I said in the beginning, than, you know, the closed world of analytic philosophers or something like that. And so it is maybe more beneficial to just disabuse them of certain popular, you know, sophistical claims. And I think that does have benefit.
Tanya, I think it's almost 10 o'clock. There's also like a question. I don't know if you want to, like, it's enough or what do you say? There's a question about the tension, like, for example, between classical kalam and post-classical tahqiq tradition. Or,
Well, I mean, just yeah, I mean, yeah, okay.
or,
all right.
or between tasawwuf and kalam, like both trying to promote the concept of tawheed, like about the conflict between these two. How have scholars from both disciplines navigated the tension between tasawwuf's experiential, mystical approach and kalam's rational, discursive approach? Maybe we can close.
Yeah,
with this
yeah. I mean, these are all
question.
kind of interesting questions. Post-classical tahqiq tradition. I mean, just you know, kind of like a newsflash. The word muhaqqiq and tahqiq existed in the classical tradition. It's not like it was invented, you know, in the post-classical period or something like that. Tahqiq just means to try to verify the truth of the matter. And oftentimes people will say قال المحققون as a kind of rhetorical, you know, propaganda move to kind of say the people who agree with me are muhaqqiqun. Well, the people who disagree don't think that obviously that they're muhaqqiqun. So I'm not sure it's actually the truth of the matter isn't going to be resolved with reference to labels of that kind. So, you know, I would suggest that students who are studying, they should take things with a kind of grain of salt, and they should, you know, there's benefit to be found in the classical works, and there's benefit to be found in the post-classical works. And so I don't really see a kind of major issue with that in particular. So the second was tasawwuf and ilm al-kalam. Well, I mean, it depends how often the debate between tasawwuf and ilm al-kalam is a terminological debate. Al-Risala al-Qushayriya is one of the kind of mainstay books of tasawwuf amongst Ahl Sunnah, and it's written by an Ash'ari mutakallim, and it contains the Ash'ari aqidah, and there's no attempt to offer like an alternative aqidah there. And the same applies to later imams of tasawwuf, Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, for example. This is about practice. It's about acquiring virtues. It's about eliminating vices. It's about bringing the aqa'id and the fiqh into your actual life, and, you know, benefiting it and benefiting others from it. But I mean, there's another tension where they use the word tasawwuf to refer to another school of philosophy, basically, which disagrees and has different positions, and you know, whether they make reference to their personal experience. I mean, shar'an, someone's personal experience is not a dalil shar'i. I don't think that should be controversial. So the aqa'id are taken from the kitab and the sunnah, and the adillah are those which are publicly accessible to everyone, and that's what people are obligated to believe or not believe. And I would just suffice with that.
Thank you very much, Sidi. I think we should leave it with that. I think we benefit a lot from your answers. Of course, there are many questions we couldn't cover now in this small time, but we are very thankful that you took the time. Of course, you drove a long way today, and we took your time. So, barakallahu fikum. I think, okay. Can we, Mehmet Amin? Can we close with a small qasida from you?